I just want to, before I call the meeting to order, I just want to try to describe the process a little bit to everybody so that you'll be aware of what we're dealing with. The first thing I need to do is ask everybody for some patience. We have rehearsed this, but it is in essence live TV, and things will and probably will go wrong maybe a couple times. There are 6 volunteers helping Mimi with looking at the screens, seeing who's there, and then we'll be helping with the counting process. And those helpers are Matt Schunke, Christine Remming, Jeannie Keys, Marianne Vogneld, and Anne Marie Rulin. So at those points in the agenda where it calls for a vote or for discussion, if you could raise your hand, one of these 6 people will see that and will put you in a queue to ask your questions, or we'll be counting you to vote. It's why we've asked for your video to be enabled so that we can see. We're going to have to do it old school, and your hand will be raised and will be literally counted. I'm hoping that that makes sense. And with that being said, I am going to call the 154th annual meeting of Emmanuel Episcopal Church to order. And I'm going to ask Allison Williams to lead us in prayer.
Thank you, Donna. When Donna asked me if I would lead an opening prayer, I looked around for a while and I actually found a Mennonite prayer, which I thought was appropriate right now, that really speaks to, I think, our calling as a community and as a parish. Great God, thank you for the constant call we hear from you every day. The wind whispering around our ears, the birds singing to us from the trees, rain pinging on the window, the good earth inviting our steps. We hear that call again and again through kind hands and warm hearts around us. Open our ears to your call, which is as expansive as the world and as particular as a poor man walking a dusty road to a cross on Calvary. Like him, help us to love, not just in word, but in deed. Love for our neighbors who are hard to love. Love for newcomers in our community. Love for people who are cast out by others. Forgive us for the times when we have failed to share your love, choosing to hoard what is freely given, fearful that we have limited resources, limited time, or that we are too tired. Thank you that even then, your consoling voice calls us. Help us to respond with cheerful hearts as we do your work. Strengthen those among us who face heavy burdens, who live with pain, physical, emotional, spiritual. Holy Spirit, bind us together as a community to sing your chorus of love faithfully, heartily. Multiply your call in us and through us. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Allison. The next item on the agenda is polls declared open. I actually am going to be doing the exact opposite of that. I am declaring them closed. This year, due to meeting online, we ask that nominations from the floor be submitted by January 22nd. There were no nominations received by that deadline, so the voting for vestry and delegates will take place later in this meeting. And you can refer to pages 30 through 33 for the report of the nominating committee. At this time, and with their consent, I appoint Mimi Shipp, Secretary Pro Tem of this meeting, and Al Ludwig as parliamentarian. I will ask that you take a few minutes to review the minutes in the last year's meeting found in your booklets on pages 4 through 14. I'm also going to ask Al to do a brief presentation or clarification. I think there was some confusion last year about who an elector is, and Al is going to clarify that for us this year.
Thank you, Donna. I did want to just take a very brief minute and confirm, how this works, what the qualifications for voting are, and what the qualifications for serving are. because I think actually there was an error in the notice in materials that suggested, on the one hand, that members who are eligible to vote at this meeting must be confirmed within the Episcopal Church. That is not the case under the bylaws, nor is it the case under the canons and constitutions of the diocese. So what the qualifications are is that electors must be members, first and foremost, in the registry of Emmanuel, and must be baptized persons and communicants, not less than 16 years of age and in good standing as defined by the canons. And the canons define good standing as simply having taken communion within the Episcopal Church or any other church in communion with the Episcopal Church in 3 times in the last 12 months. Realizing, and we're in a strange year where, I think at least some of us certainly probably got those 3 times in before COVID shut us all down. The chair of this meeting, that being Donna, as the presiding officer of the parish at this point, really has the final say on who is a qualified elector for this purpose. To elaborate, or to take it a step further and discuss the qualifications for serving in office, there is no confirmation requirement for any offices, including vestry, except for lay delegates to convention. So the only office that's being voted on that technically requires confirmation are the lay delegates at the meeting. But beyond that, anyone who is a member in good standing of the church has the right to vote here and to serve on vestry. So that was all I wanted to clarify, and I appreciate it, Donna. I'll let her continue with the agenda so we can move on.
All right. And just to clarify further, if you are on this meeting, you are eligible to vote. Notices of the meeting and the meeting booklet was sent to everyone in our directory. And if you got one, we're not going to be communion monitors. Maybe none of us can meet that criteria of having gotten communion 3 times. But as Clive and Paul keep telling us, spiritual communion is the same as the real deal. So we're just going to go ahead with, if you're on this call, you are able to vote. Let's see. Next is presentation and approval of the 2020 meeting minutes, pages 4 through 14. I certainly hope that you're not trying to read all of the information right now. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at them already. And I'm looking to see if there's a call for a motion to accept the minutes from 2020. You can, I see Susan Everson's hand raised. Thank you, Susan. Is there a second? Jeff Remming seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the minutes being approved from the 2020 meeting, raise your hand. And keep them up. This is our first practice round for all of our volunteers to catch and make sure that everybody's been counted. And I think we forgot the signal for how are we going to know when you've already finished with that, Mimi, and counters.
I think that's going to come in a direct message to you.
All right, from Mary Ann.
Or from the helpers. They're counting. They're counting their peoples.
All right.
Where is the raise hand button?
The raise hand is in reactions. We were not going to require that you use that for a couple of reasons. Not everyone will be able to find that, number one. And number two, you kind of need to take it off after you raise your hand.
Okay, but you can do it.
You can.
All right, I've got the word that they don't see any dissent, so you can take your hand down. Thank you. The Emmanuel Church Foundation report. Before Matthew gives his report, I want to thank Matthew for his work as president of the foundation. And I want to thank Gary Tapana for his work as treasurer of the foundation. The entire foundation board for their leadership also deserves thanks, and that's Matthew Cruz, Kelly Garrett, Olabisa Yukanana, Carl Reef, Gary Tapana, and Amy Ryan. Matthew Cruz and Carl Reef rotate off the board, and Richard Keyes and Jeff Remming will join the board for a 3-year term. And I'm now going to turn it over to Matthew Cruz for his report.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I guess the first part of my presentation has already been taken care of, but I do want to thank everyone for service on the board with me. And thank you for Jeff Remming and Richard Keyes for coming on for the 2021 year. Second, this is the first time I think I've wanted to do this. I want to make a special mention to 2 contributions for the 2020 year. Number one, we had a large gift from Harris Gerhard's estate. So thank you very much. And second, I want to thank the vestry for the contribution of the remaining part of the Clergy Housing Fund. I want to thank their trust in the foundation as stewards of those funds, which will be now managed for the benefit of the entire parish in perpetuity. So just want to make a special mention on that. Third, I want to mention that the report for the foundation is on page 16 through page 19. Our funds are managed and we receive reports from those funds a little bit late. So my part of the foundation report will be based on numbers in November. So our market value will be slightly different than the final report that Gary put together. But that's the only difference, is the market value between November 30th and December 31st. So very slight difference there, but I do want to draw that attention. So, okay, with that, I want to share my screen, and I'm just going to give a high-level presentation. And then if you want to drill down into the actual details of the foundation activity, those financials are in the report in all detail. Then thank you, Gary, for putting those together. Okay, so for my part of the presentation, I just want to present some high-level detail for everyone. Some of you have heard me give this speech a couple of times, and for everyone new, hopefully you'll kind of have a better sense for the foundation. Number one, let's see if I can get rid of, no, I'm just going to go with it. So here's the value, the market value of the foundation, which combines 2 parts: the major foundation, as well as we have a sub-account basically that's directly tasked with funding the missions. So this is a combined of the 2, and you can see the value of the foundation over the past since 2001. There's 2 different colors. The bottom color is the permanently restricted assets. These are assets that are basically all contributions since the foundation was established in 1974. I believe we're up to roughly 2.8 million in contributions. And then the top level is the sort of the growth of the foundation above the permanently restricted. So this was called temporarily restricted. This is the surplus. This is again the gains above the gifts. This is what we use to provide donations, the contribution to the church. And then I turn to the next. This second slide is the annual contributions that the foundation is given to the church. There's no restrictions on how those contributions are spent. This is our contribution. For 2020, the foundation provided $148,000 to the church operating budget, and for 2021, it'll be $158,000. The calculation, which also is in the foundation report, is 4.5% of the total assets times the 5-year rolling average of the foundation fund. The reason we do that, as you can see in this slide, is that we want to keep it as smooth as possible so that when the When vestry is trying to prepare a budget, they can have a good sense for what the foundation can provide as financial support. We don't want to see any down years. You saw one in the 2007, 8, 9 period, the last financial crisis. 2020, as weird as it was still an up year. So at some point we'll see a downturn, but so far we've been able to grow the contributions quite nicely. I believe, and then as the note on the bottom of that page, over the past 10 years, the foundation has contributed roughly 1.3 million in funds to help support the operating budget of the church. And then I will turn to the last slide. Couple of points. I think this is some educational piece. The permanently restricted, as I said, was the contributions. Those are held in what we call perpetuity. So there's no fixed end value. So we assume that the Emmanuel Church will last forever. And so we will manage the foundation accordingly. As I said, it's a multi-generational gift since 1974. So it's quite amazing. Lastly, I think this point is has come up a little bit, but I want to make it clear that the permanently restricted, if we looked at managing the foundation as an institution, like a pension, the permanently restricted acts as sort of a floor, a risk management bench, a floor level that we will not pierce. There are rules in place that basically say that we can distribute those permanently restricted, but there's some very high hurdles that need to be met via the vestry as well as voting from the parish. So, but otherwise, we don't distribute the permanently restricted. So it's a floor there. The top level that we saw on the previous slide is the temporarily restricted. That's all the earnings and market gains. That's also the expenses that the foundation incurs as well as contributions. Again, we vote every year for that distribution, which is $158,000 for 2021. And I want to make this point as well, is that the larger we have a surplus of temporarily restricted assets over the contributions, the more, I wouldn't say aggressive, but the more growth we can invest. So it's kind of a positive snowball where we can accelerate the gifts, the contributions to the church, the more aggressive we can grow the funds. When we can grow the funds faster when we have a larger buffer over the permanently restricted. We're sort of in that situation where we can see some acceleration. So that's a very positive for the foundation as well as a positive for the church. With that said, again, I'll finish with taking any questions anyone has. Again, all the details are in the report in terms of the annual expenses, donations, the historical donations, how we calculate the contributions. So Donna, I think I'm good for if anyone has any questions.
All right. I don't see that anyone who's monitoring sees any hands raised. Marianne? What?
I see that.
Mara has a question.
Oh,
What are the hurdles that you said that would have to, or the standards to go into the permanently restricted? And are those legal or just ones that the foundation sets?
Those are in the, I believe those are in the incorporated bylaws of the foundation. And it's a vote from the vestry, then it goes to a vote to the congregation, and then it goes back to the vestry. So there's three hurdles that need to be met there. And as far as I know, it's never been done before. But just so everyone's clear. So it's like a 2/3 supermajority. It's not a standard majority type vote. I thought there was a question from the Kuhns. If I saw that. I believe the question was if there's any gifts when we donate to the foundation in honor of someone, does it go into the permanently restricted? And the answer to that is Yes, it does. So if somebody gave a gift in 1974, that gift is still providing benefit to the parish today.
Jim Gretsch has a question. Jim, you'll need to unmute yourself. I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, I think vestry has taken action, has it not, that if a contribution has been made or from an estate that has not been designated, it goes to the foundation. Is that correct?
That's actually a question for the vestry, although I do know that there was a more of an explicit policy set.
The vestry had has a bequest policy now that we've passed. And that is what you said, Jim, that it will go into the foundation if it's not designated, unless the rector, treasurer, or senior warden see a very specific need, at which point the vestry can decide to designate it elsewhere. So that's going to be the default, but the vestry still has the opportunity, if necessary, to decide otherwise based on what they know about facing the parish.
And I will just add that my research on part of being the committee to help discuss that and provide some insight, that's pretty standard language and pretty standard operating for many Episcopal churches across the country.
Althea Kortenhoff, you have a question?
This isn't really a question, it's an historic statement. As you know, my husband was one of the original founders, and it was absolutely critical in their minds that persons donating should understand that they were giving in perpetuity for the benefit, so that after they were not alive anymore, their assets would still benefit the church. So there frequently have been questions about invading the principle, but the founders really were very serious about making it difficult to do in order to make people feel that they were really giving a permanent system of support for the church. Historically, the foundation's just about to celebrate its 50th anniversary, and that's worth noting. That's all.
Thank you, Althea. Any other questions?
Yes,
Oh.
Sarah Herstand Myers has a question.
Yeah, I just wanted, from some of the other questions, I'm wondering if there's confusion. So you're, by permanently restricted, you're saying that's the body of the endowment that just sits there and generates income. Is that correct? So that if you give a gift to the foundation that is restricted in honor of, that is named in honor of somebody, you can be assured that it remains there to generate income for future expenditure. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, I want to be clear that when we invest, we don't have two separate buckets. One is invested just in fixed income, one is invested in, so the entire fund is invested, but we keep track of all the contributions over the years. And that is what represents, as of today, 2.8 million. So if the fund the foundation corpus drops to 2.8 million, we can no longer distribute anything besides just income generated from that 2.8 million. Once we have that surplus, like today, we can have more growth assets. That's why it's growing the way it is today, because but yes, the answer is anything that comes into it is permanently restricted, and that is held in perpetuity with no design really to distribute it unless under extreme situations. Because as was mentioned, this fund, there was a previous foundation, and that foundation was raided, and they had to set up a new one, and that's why we added that is why additional restrictions were put in, so that it could not be raided under extreme situations.
Great. Thanks for the clarification. Sounds really good.
Matt, we have 2 questions in the chat, and then Sherry Keltz has a question. From the chat, Al Ledwood asked, is there any flexibility to utilize more of the temporarily restricted fund outside of the cap you described, or is that a fixed cap that cannot be exceeded?
When we say cap, I'm not sure what we're defining as cap. Are we talking about the 4.5% that we use as our rules for distribution?
Yes, precisely. Is that a policy established by the trustees, or is that enshrined in the trust documents?
That is a policy set by the board members of the foundation.
So in other words, that there is some flexibility on the part of the trustees to make a distribution of more than that 4.5% cap.
If the board would want to change the policy, they can.
And I can speak to that because it happened on my watch back in 2013, and the 4.5% is well within the standard. When we look at our peers who have a pretty sizable gap between the core principal and the growth, that 4.5% is right in the middle, maybe a little above the middle in terms of generosity and annual contributions back to its parish.
Elizabeth Call asked a question in the chat. Are parishioners making a specific gift, not their annual pledge, able to designate whether they want it to go to the foundation or to the operating fund? And I'm going to answer that as a member of the vestry, and the answer is yes. When you make your gift, you can decide whether or not it goes to the foundation, or when you write your estate documents, you can say, I want this to go to the church for operations or for XYZ project, or I want it to go to the foundation. Or you can leave it unrestricted and then the vestry gets to decide.
I will just add one thing to that as well. Is right now we have one sub account that sometimes I fail to mention enough, that we received a gift before my time, but for I believe it was $100,000 to the foundation, but it was specifically a sub account specifically designated to support mission contributions. So that we donate, and I didn't mention this earlier, so I apologize. It's in the report. But for 2021, $6,000 from the foundation, specifically from the sub account to missions, $6,000 will go to support missions. So if you have in your estate that you want to leave a significant amount, the board has the ability to set up a sub account so that if you wanted a specific support within the parish, you can do so. Otherwise, it goes into the general permanently restricted. But there is a chance that you could separate that out with a large enough gift.
Sherry, you had a question?
No, actually, I just wanted to direct you to the questions in chat that had been for a while.
Thank you for helping.
I see Pam's hand is up.
Just a quick question, God forbid, but if something happened to Emmanuel and it dissolved, like we've had other churches in our diocese dissolve or join with another church, what would happen with the foundation?
I don't know that I have an answer to that. I'm going to remain optimistic and say that that's never going to happen. But if anyone wants to give a more legal answer, it's outside of my purview. Al Ludwig seems to have that answer.
I would just say litigation, unless there's something in the trust documents that specifically dictates where that's going to go. And I haven't read them, but if it's not an answered question in the existing documents, we would all have to figure it out through the diocese and through the parish, working hopefully cooperatively to come to an amicable solution.
Is there any other question before we move on?
I'd like to jump in while there's a little bit of dead space here and just point out that there are over 100 little windows. We can't see any more than 25 at a time, and they constantly reorient themselves.
Right.
And so we are trying to scan through everyone, and just to minimize everyone's frustration, I want everyone to know that we are looking for raised hands, and sometimes we have to get them through the chat, and sometimes we have to look for them physically on 1/5 of the monitors that we can't see at any given time.
Thank you, Michael. That being said, do you see any other raised hands? I do not. So I think that we will move on. Before we hear the treasurer's report, I just want to say a personal word of thanks to Gary DePana and Jeff Remming for the effort and expertise they've shared with Emmanuel this past year. Very early on, Jeff suggested the PPP as a way of helping Emmanuel. After much vestry discussion, he then shepherded the vestry through the entire process. He stayed on as a treasurer far beyond the time commitment he had originally identified. Tom Schroeder then filled in temporarily, assisting Teresa Grumke in the office. And I then asked Gary if he would serve as a financial consultant to the vestry to get us through the budgeting process and the annual meeting, because I didn't have the heart to ask him to be treasurer again. Luckily for us, Gary agreed. So in Thanksgiving for both Gary and Jeff's help, I've made a contribution to the foundation in their names. Our congregation owes them a debt of thanks, and I hope that you join me in, expressing that gratitude in a way that suits you. I should also mention that Gary has agreed to stay on in his informal role as financial consultant. Just in case any of you financial types feel that you might be called to be our treasurer, feel free to let me know that, and I'll hook you up with Gary, or you can contact him directly. Within Gary's report, you'll also hear from the stewardship committee, and I do want to thank Tom Smith, John Long, Peggy Schroeder, and Joanne Warren for their leadership in this fall campaign. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Gary's report.
Thanks, Donna. And by the way, before I get started, I just want to direct this to Althea. One of the most enjoyable hours of my entire life was spent with Joe Kortenoff talking about the foundation. And Joe gave us and me that day extremely invaluable information. I can read the documents, but he gave me the passion behind the foundation and the reason that it is set up the way that it's set up. So I did want to have a call out to Althea for that wonderful conversation that I had quite a few years ago. I'm going to try to share my screen. Also, I will tell you, some of you may have seen a flurry of activity. My work laptop did not like the Zoom link, so I switched very quickly to an old Mac that I have in the corner, and I have a lamp on top of 5 40-year-old law books that is providing the light, so I don't look like Deep Throat back here. So let's see if I can do this on this. Okay, we're getting better here. All righty, unless anyone stops me, I'm going to get started here. Okay, please save your questions until the end. This is the financial report with 2020, the 2021 budget. Oh, but with the questions, since you're muted right now, I thought that I would answer a couple of questions that I'm sure that you have. The first, how long is my talk going to be? For these matters, I turn to scripture, and this was a New Testament answer out of Acts. And there was a young man named Eutychus sitting on a windowsill. And as Paul kept on talking, he was overcome by sleep and fell down from the 3rd floor and was picked up dead. Hopefully my talk won't be that long. And then, what can I hope for if I do a good job today? I actually turned to the unfortunately, I turned to the Old Testament for this answer. So I got an Old Testament answer. Very well, he replied. I allow you cow's dung in place of human excrement. You can bake your bread on that. So, what is my prayer today? Single-story homes and really good tasting bread. Emmanuel receives its support from different areas, different funds. And just a word about those financials. They've broken out into 3 general funds, but 50 sub-funds. One is the operating fund that supports our day-to-day operations. Many of you are familiar with it. Most clergy and staffing is funded there, a diocesan assessment, building upkeep, other costs. It's funded by your pledge contributions, unrestricted gifts. The foundation's primary endowment distribution is usually allocated there by vestry. Designated funds are unrestricted by donor or other funds coming in, but they're designated in purpose by the vestry. Like Parents' Day Out would be an example, our parking lot fund, a major capital reserve fund that we have. And then the third type, they're restricted funds. They have donor imposed restrictions. They're given and used for a specific purpose. And we are very careful to follow the direction by our donors. Examples are extremely numerous. Faith and Forsake of All, Food Center, where your Christmas offering goes, other missions, the Senior High International Mission Trip, so on and so forth. So I do want to emphasize that we are very careful with those funds, and we have them allocated actually in 50 different separate funds within these 3 categories. Here. Okay, so this is the kind of income statement, if you will, for all of our funds combined. And we'll break these out in just a minute, but here's the general, not general as an operating fund, but the combined portion of the funds. First, support received in revenue, or income, if you will, is up slightly year over year from 2019 to 2020. As Donna mentioned, it includes $100,000 in one-time Paycheck Protection Program funds. It was a forgivable and now forgiven loan from the federal government program, and that helped us, and I don't know how that happened. Sorry about that. Okay, maybe we're back in better shape. It helps us offset an overall 9% drop we had in contributions. It prevented certain staff furloughs during the course of the year. And it also provides us more solid footing going into 2021. Our support provided our expenses. Those were down 11%. Staffing down slightly, but it does comprise 67% of the total. Facilities, that's insurance, maintenance, utilities, that dropped as well by $40,000. Our diocesan support was reduced, while other outreach was steady. Administration costs, we had a drop in those, but those were offset by an increase in COVID-related costs shifting to online worship and work from home for our staff. The income or surplus, if you will, from, again, these are all funds combined. It's important to note that the surplus really relates to one-time funds, the PPP funds, and a bequest. And without those, we would not have seen a surplus. We'll talk about this later, but a transfer from the Clergy Housing Assistance Fund to the foundation also took place during 2020. I'll shift to break the funds out. So you'll hear me say a couple of the same things again as we go through this, but I'll try to keep it fresh. Okay, here's our general or operating fund. Those revenues were up slightly in 2020 compared to 2019. Again, the reason for that was an allocation of about 2/3 of the PPP funds to general. We'll talk about the remainder of the PPP funds in a minute, and those offset a drop in contributions. General expense dropped $66,000. General or operating staffing was relatively flat. Facilities dropped due to COVID, and also reduction in earthquake insurance that kicked in during 2020. We pay our diocesan assessment out of general, and that support did drop below our minimum assessment of $98,000. And as discussed, certain other expenses in general decreased. Okay, this bottom line here is really important. Since January of 2017, the reserve, basically the fund balance we have for general, and this is to cover routine cash flow whenever your contributions coming in are not as high as expenses for a month, and also unforeseen events. That dropped from 120,000 down to about 50,000, and it would have dropped to 8,000 if not for shifting some of the clergy housing funds in 2019. This PPP allocation ensured an increase back to 90,000, and that's determined by vestry last year to be the minimum prudent reserve level, I'll shift over to designated and restricted funds. So I've got these 50 separate funds condensed into 4 categories: ministries beyond the parish, other parish activity, facilities capital funds, so those long-term capital kinds of funds, and the clergy housing assistance fund. So for classification purposes, our primary ministries beyond include Faith and Forsake of All, missions and outreach, food center, clergy discretionary funds. And for those funds together, overall support increased, and that was driven by Faith and Forsake of All, an 18% increase. Food center contributions were through the roof and more than doubled compared to 2019, and missions and outreach was also up substantially year over year. The staffing expense within this category is incurred by Faith and Forsake of All. So I wanted to call that to your attention. And also direct outreach support increased 13,000 or about 30%. This support reached over 20 groups in the community and the greater St. Louis area, continues to be vitally important. A listing of those groups specifically is in the annual report. And by the way, Paul Metzler during his sermon also called out to a number of those ministries, which I really appreciated hearing. This is a vital lifeline that Emmanuel provides to many. I did want to mention that the missions and outreach area transferred. This is down at the bottom. I would point my cursor there, but when I did that, I jumped slides. So I'm without a pointer in this, so I apologize. But missions and outreach transferred funds to Faith and Forsake of All and Food Center. That's in the fund transfer, but it's netted because it goes from one ministry to another within Emmanuel. So it's not until those funds go out the door. So the numbers by themselves understate what our missions committee is doing for outreach within Emmanuel, because it is netted. The total funds on hand has increased as the support received by Food Center was greater in the short term than the ability to provide support to the community. This slide is not a happy slide. This is all other parish activity that's not in general and not in missions, that's all current. And as you can see with the closure of our facilities through most of 2020, that this activity dropped. So what you see in terms of a drop in activity is shown in terms of the numbers. Facilities capital actually was an area that we had more inflows of revenues during 2020. There's this area, and again, we keep each one of these separate. So there's segregated funds, definitely segregated funds. But there are, these together comprise a capital reserve fund, parking lot fund, major steeple renovation fund, which was set up during 2020, music preservation, and then outdoor signage funds. Oh, and then it has included a now concluded 150th capital campaign, which was highly successful. We are still receiving a few donations coming in, and those will be set aside if needed for major steeple renovation in 2021 or beyond. Part of the funds received was a very substantial bequest that came in. And also vestry allocated 28,000 in PPP funds to capital reserves. Okay, the Clergy Housing Assistance Fund. That was a fund that was set up about 25 years ago when we sold the Emmanuel Rectory on South Gore. At that time, the proceeds were designated by vestry to provide loans to Emmanuel clergy that needed them. And then the loans were to be repaid either during or at the conclusion of their tenure. The fund's been used a number of occasions, most recently several years ago. However, very recently, a portion of that was used for some clergy interview costs a few years ago, as well as a backstop for the operating fund reserve. We just discussed that just a little while ago. And so it was determined in 2020, last year, the vestry determined the best use of the remaining clergy housing fund was to redesignate them and to transfer them to the foundation to follow on to Matthew's comments so that they could be invested for the long term. And the earnings could be invested in a manner yielding greater returns. And those earnings from those funds can then be returned to Emmanuel for decades to come. Okay, so this is the same slide that you saw a few minutes ago. And these are all of our funds combined. So in summary, we had $1 million plus coming in revenues during the course of the year. In terms of expenses going out, about over 60% of that is staffing. Money for our facilities, while it dropped in 2020, it will increase in the future with building openings and so on. Diocesan support, as I mentioned, is now below the minimum assessment level in 2020. And so that's our snapshot for the year of all funds combined. I'm gonna shift over to the general operating budget for 2021. That subset, we don't really budget for designated and restricted funds, although like Missions Committee does budget, Food Center does budget, and understand Faith and Forsake of All does, but on a centralized or total basis, we don't budget for designated and restricted funds. However, this is the general operating budget for 2021. We expect a 19% decrease in revenues. Budgeted contributions, we expect and are budgeted to be down 17%. That's offset a little bit by increased foundation support. However, the PPP funding is one time, so those funds will no longer be present for 2021. So we see an overall revenue drop expected from about 800,000 down to about 650,000 in general. Now I'm going to turn to Tom to explain the stewardship campaign, and I'll flip to this next side and turn to Tom.
Thank you, Gary. Good morning, everyone. Just real quick, I want to reiterate Donna's thanks to Peggy Schrader, Joanne Warren, and John Long on the Stewardship Committee. Their work, plus the work of Mimi Ship, Teresa Grumke, Gary Tapana, the Finance Committee, and Donna Erickson in the vestry, put in a lot of time and effort and love to end the stewardship campaign. So thank you to everyone. Want to point out a couple things from Gary's slide, and thank you, Gary, for preparing this. We are at 134 pledging units for a pledge amount of $454,226. Even in these difficult economic and stressful and uncertain times, and even with the transition that we find ourselves in, I want to point out some very positive and hopeful and faithful things. 41 pledging units kept their pledge the same. 38 pledging units increased their pledge, and we have 11 new pledging units who are not pledging, or family units, in 2020. I think that shows a leap of faith and hopefulness for Emmanuel and where we are going in 2021.
All right, just on the bottom of the slide, We have timing issues with all of this because we try to get as much of the information in as soon as possible. So this schedule here shows a bit more in total pledges than does the budget. The budget includes as a subset of total contributions. In general, it includes about 450,000 in pledges, and it's been discounted through the budgeting process for amounts estimated to be uncollectible. And then a plug for Tom and the others, and that is the stewardship campaign never stops. As you are able, please consider a pledge to Emmanuel's operating fund, as well as other worthy causes within Emmanuel. We will not stop taking your pledge now. Okay, this is an eye chart, and I'm not going to stay on this eye chart very much. I will call to your attention that there is a 5-year version of this in the annual report on page 25. It does show that we have dropped in terms of pledges and in terms of pledge units. I do believe that we are a very vibrant parish and we are a very resilient parish. I will say that in the interest of transparency, here are the numbers. I apologize that they're not on a Matthew Cruz fancy chart. That's beyond my physical capabilities, but glad to discuss these. And again, the numbers from the last 5 years are within the annual report, just for brevity purposes. Okay, so back to the operating budget. On the expense side, we are budgeting an overall 15% reduction. Staffing was reduced by about 33% in the budget for next year, from 538 to 363. And this is with the vestry expectation of staffing, which is roughly consistent with our current lay staff and 1 full-time priest equivalent. And I say priest equivalent because for the first part of the year, we will have 2 half-time priests that are working with us and providing ministries here at Emmanuel, followed by a full-time priest once that individual is identified and comes to Emmanuel. Diocesan supports increased slightly above 2020, but it's still below our minimum assessment of $98,000. And I'll bring your attention to administration, going from 40 to 58,000, but that also includes 25,000 for priest search and relocation. Overall, vestry passed a balanced budget. The vestry thought it was necessary to maintain its reserve or fund balance in 2021 as well at that 90,000, what is believed to be the prudent minimum level. So with that, I want to also give a big thanks to the staff, wardens, and vestry, the finance committee, the stewardship committee, Jeff Rimming, the groups and individuals that I forgot to thank. However, I did not forget to thank Teresa Grumke. I'll tell you, Emmanuel is so fortunate that Teresa's with us. Teresa is outstanding. If you have gotten a chance to meet her, and most of you have, she's awesome. If you haven't, she's awesome. So my hat goes off to Teresa for all of her work, which made this pretty darn easy. And also, in addition, I want to remember single-story homes and really good tasting bread and the resilience of this parish. So with that, I will stop the screen share and we'll start the questions.
We've got a question from Matt Shunke, and then I'm going to write down a list and we'll get to the rest of you guys.
Thanks, Gary, for that. I'm just wondering if you can provide more information about the Clergy Housing Fund, sort of the history of what that is, and some of the reasons why the moves were made that to put that fund elsewhere.
So I wasn't in my role whenever the decision was made to put it elsewhere, but I'm glad to talk a minute about it, Matt. And that is, Emmanuel had a rectory decades ago, and it was sold. The proceeds from that rectory were put in a bit of a mini foundation. And to Althea's point earlier, Then those funds, which were intended to be kept, invested, and returned, were then spent. Emmanuel later bought another rectory years and years ago, and then that one was sold, and those funds it was simply decided at the time, Matt, that those would go for clergy housing loan assistance for those, especially since Webster's a higher cost area. It would help clergy coming in. That's been used several times. My guess would be under 10 throughout the last 25 years, probably over 5 under 10. And so that decision then was made by vestry to preserve what was left, since they're one-time funds, and it was so easy to see those funds go away, that it would be more prudent to send those over to the foundation. So again, those would be invested. So under the foundation's current formula, you would see 4.5% of 250,000 returned to Emmanuel annually and perpetually. Is that good enough?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Al Ludwig has a question.
So I wanted to first raise the point as a comment, and then I'll ask the question. That last year was the first time this parish, in recent years at least, has not made its full diocesan contribution. The point I really want to make is there are some thresholds for potential punitive action that the diocese can take after 2 consecutive years of failing to do so. I did notice that the amount went up, which is a good thing, even though I know how stretched we are, and I appreciate very, very much, what a sacrifice that is, especially when we're losing revenue and pledging units as we are. But I did want to point out that a second year in a row carries with it the potential for consequences from the diocese, including reducing our representation at convention, among other things. So the question I have is, what was our required amount, and how far off are we, or did they reduce it to the point where that small increase from last year actually hits the mark?
No, it's $98,000 is our minimum assessment, Al, for 2021. It's based off of 12.5% of operating income from 2 years prior. That is the formula. So we could probably expect that to drop some in the next year or two, somewhat, but it's 98,000. So we are that far short. I'll also say that these were tough decisions by vestry, and you'll also see and recall that we're budgeting for 1 priest, not 1.5 and not 2 priests, and that is the best that we can do for 2021. We will, I won't speak on behalf of vestry, but I'll say that if or as contributions come in that place it favorable to budget, then vestry certainly has the opportunity to reassess what to do with those funds. I won't speak for them to say what they would do with them, but one of the areas that they would at least look at would be the diocesan assessment.
Thank you. It's helpful.
Clerk Hoteling had a question in the chat. Was last year's income $40,000 or over $100,000?
Was last year, hey, Clark, explain a little bit.
I thought on that last slide you showed $40,000 income, and then earlier it was $124,000.
Yeah, and that's the confusion. You may remember one slide that I had in big bold and gold that I was going from total funds to separate funds. The number that you recall that's over 100,000 would be all funds combined, and that reflects that uptick, Clark, in capital, in facilities capital that came in.
Got
the
it.
General operating fund was 40,000 plus for 2020, which brought the operating reserve up to 90,000.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Pat Wiltsey had a question.
Myself unmuted. I'm wondering about the steeple fund. We haven't really heard too much about that, and I know that it's something that's in the works, and I wonder if we could have that in our list of donations, when we go in on the computer to donate, that's not listed. And so, you know, I was wondering, that might encourage more help with that.
First, I think you're going to hear, and thanks, Pat. You're going to hear more about this in a few minutes, I think, with the other reports. And secondly, if Teresa is not on, I'll make sure. And we've talked about it. That's a new category for us, if you will. So I am confident that it will be added shortly. Thanks.
Thank you.
Davis Allen had a question in the chat. Gary, a terrific report. Where is the severance payment accounted for?
I can't address anything to do with any severance payment, so I'll turn any comments about that over to Donna. I apologize, but I'll have to turn any comments to Donna.
There is a legally binding non-disclosure agreement about the separation agreement. It was not severance, it was a separation agreement. And what I can tell you is that there was a one-time payment, but because Emmanuel did not have the full amount, that was a one-time payment with subsequent payments being made. And as I understand the budget, that was all included in 2020's figures and doesn't show up at all in 2021. Is that right?
That's correct.
So I am not able to share the total amount that was given.
Sarah Herstein Myers had a question.
That was asked by Al and answered by Gary already. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave Buck had a question in the chat. Gary, for us non-financial people, the President of the US always begins the State of the Union by filling in the blank. The State of the Union is blank. Please fill in this blank. The financial health of Emmanuel is blank. Thank you.
I'll tell you, my word of the day is resilient. And is it great? Can I say it's great, Dave? By the way, this is more than a one-word answer, so I do apologize. But Dave, I've not known you very often to give one-word answers, so give me a little latitude here. That's a joke, Dave. Anyway, I think that this parish is extremely resilient. Hey, listen, we faced a lot of adversity during 2020. The whole world is facing adversity. The adversity is continuing. We had leadership challenges within Emmanuel. We are a vibrant parish, and I look out there, and while I would rather see the faces in the pews, I see such wonderful acts of kindness by people on the screen I see, and the next one over, and the next one over, and the next one over. So I believe that our parish is resilient, and I believe that our parish will see an increase in contributions, quite frankly.
Kathleen Martin had a question.
Thank you. Gary, I believe you said that we were keeping administrative cost at the same level. Is that correct?
They're going up some.
I meant administrative staffing costs.
The staffing costs, the lay staff, the expectation, and by the way, the vestry does, just to be clear, the vestry does not allocate to specific positions. They allocate an overall amount of money, and the expectation and the chart we looked at would be to continue the lay staff in the manner in which it exists today. Is that clear?
So my question is around the fact that we had Jamie Shannon as part of our administrative support, and is that, when we say at the same level, is that with or without that position?
It is without that position as a paid position. Donna, do you want to say anything to that?
I was just shaking my head in agreement that is without Jamie's paid position. We have volunteers. We have Anne-Marie Rulin now, who volunteers 20 hours plus, certainly in preparation for the annual meeting. She was way more than 20 hours a week, but that is a volunteer position. And Mimi is confident that with such capable volunteers, we will be able to meet the requirements for the congregation without incurring another paid position at this point.
I think there's a concern that of the demand on Mimi's time, which is already over and above. And so that's all I want to say.
So
And
just
and we recognize that and would concur with you on that.
And just a quick add on to that, which I do not disagree at all, Kathleen. Throughout the decades, we've both seen throughout the decades, Emmanuel has relied more and less, depending on years, on volunteer staff in the office versus paid staff. And this is going to be one of those years when we rely more, not less, on the volunteer staff. But I think that the vestry's done an excellent job with allocating the funds as best that they could.
Pam, I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce your name. Baloli has a question in the chat. She says, Gary, great succinct report. Could you expand on severance payment, exact amount, and a pool of it that came from PPE operating fund? And I think we've already hit that with regard to, we can't expand on that question. So Pam asked another question that, Gary, is it possible to give directly to diocesan assessment to help our dollars get more closely to what we are expected to give?
It is, yes. The answer is a plain and simple yes. And we did receive one donation during 2020 that went directly, through Emmanuel and to the diocese that did help a little bit, a lot, but we're short quite a bit in closing the gap on the diocesan assessment. So that donation was highly appreciated, and we would be glad to take additional donations for that as well.
Gary, I want to add on to that real quick. Obviously the answer is yes, but I want people to understand that our money for the diocesan assessment comes from our general funds. So that's reliant upon the pledging that we get from the congregation. So when our pledges are down, that directly affects how much goes to that diocesan assessment. And as you saw on the slide earlier, those numbers are down dramatically. So yes, we can obviously accept a designated amount to go to that, but that does also affect where the money comes from.
Yeah, and to add on, or to basically echo, the vestry did everything that they could with the funds that they had coming through the door. There were tough discussions. There were decisions that no one wanted to make, but vestry has to work within the financials that it's given. So to add on, or to echo, I guess, what Christine said, don't start, please don't start shifting monies from operating to specific causes, because then it makes that job even tougher.
Catherine Ziegler had a question in the chat. Am I correct in understanding the ability of the church to make the housing loans to clergy became not legally possible? So that is why the funds went into the foundation.
If that is correct, I'm not aware of it. But that decision was made months prior to me being in my position, Catherine.
It is very, very difficult to give loans from the church to an employee of the church. The way people were going about it in the past, it became not legally possible.
There are certain, I think I'm reading your mind on this, Marion. There are certain, like you just can't do an interest-free loan without imputing income to the individual. So it does become more difficult. I don't believe that it became more difficult. I believe that it's always been difficult. And I can't really address, because I don't know all the interest rates over the years, and it's beyond the scope of this presentation.
David Shipp had a question in the chat. With reduction in clergy FTE, what reduction in clergy support for the parish should be anticipated? Donna, I think
that's more about Donna.
We are going to be a parish that has one full-time priest instead of 1.5 or 2 or 2.5 that we've had in the past. There will be more reliance on the volunteer and the caring committee, the ministries among ourselves to supplement that. There's no doubt about it. But that also depends on who we get assigned by Bishop Dion, who gets appointed, what their skills are, what their expectations are. And I would say that that's all still to be determined.
Sandy Cooper has a question in the chat. Would you please clarify the extent of Emmanuel's financial commitment to Faith and for the Sake of All and what this ministry entails? Thank you.
So the financial commitment part, there are no operating funds that go to Faith and for Sake of All. So those would be specific donations that are made to Faith and for Sake of All, grants that Faith and for Sake of All applies for and receives as well. And then for 2020, 7,500, I did not mention this earlier, but 7,500 of the PPP funds went to Faith and for Sake of All to reflect a portion of the salaries that were continued and the work that was continued during the pandemic. So I don't know if this answers your question. So you're welcome to follow up if I didn't specifically answer it.
Sandy, I would direct you to page 49. There is a report from Gabrielle Kennedy, the director of Faith and for the Sake of All, which does outline more about their scope of ministry.
I would also tell you that they get grants, and they have a grant last year and this year from the Diocese of Missouri. They got a very large grant from the Lutheran Church, and they are looking, they apply for grants a lot and will continue to do that.
In fact, some funds that came from our missions committee has enabled them to hire someone to specifically help them look for grants.
Allison Williams has a question, and Pam Penrose, I see your hand and I will get to you as soon as I can. Allison Williams had a question in the chat. In our allocation of staff funds, were we able to provide increases to our staff and or hold benefits costs stable for them?
Yes, there's an increase within that for lay staff.
And in fact, after this meeting, the vestry, both current and new, are asked to stay on the line. That's one of the things that we're going to be talking about right after this meeting.
Margaret and Bill Rowe, along with Debbie Martin, asked the question in chat, might we be assigned a deacon? Can we have a deacon appointed?
Gary, do you want me to answer that?
By all means.
I have spoken to Canon to the Ordinary, Doris Westfall. A deacon has been on their radar for Emmanuel for several months. That certainly is a possibility, but that's ultimately the decision of the bishop about who that person would be and when and how they would start.
Pam Penrose had a question.
I know in the past, the vestry has often made one-on-one contact with people who did not pledge for the coming year. And I was wondering if the vestry did that this year as well.
The short answer is yes. And I don't know if Tom wants to add anything or anyone on stewardship add anything to that.
I would just say yes, there were efforts made by the stewardship committee and by the vestry to reach out to just about everybody multiple times. Thank you.
I will say this, hold Marion, I will say this, that the timing of pledges coming in, Pam, has been later this year than in any previous year that I've ever been connected with, attributable to fill in the blank. You can fill in the reasons as much as I can. But number one is simply not having a stewardship Sunday where people could physically bring pledge cards in.
Charlie Walsh has asked in the chat, can you explain the formula used for determining the diocesan pledge?
12.5% of 2 years ago operating income. So for 2021, it would be 12.5% of 2019's operating income. Is that clear?
And I've been told that I missed a question from Roger and Nancy Grow, and I don't see it in my chat. So if someone could either read that, or Roger, Nancy, if you could ask it, I'd appreciate it.
Their question is, can you explain the line item, ministry and education, and why it would go from 12,000 in 2020 to 29,000 in 2021?
Yes, I can. Most of it's related to the fact that, and I think we're referring to operating in general, most of it's related to the fact that we didn't spend hardly anything in 2020. So it goes up to reflect at least a half a year, sometime mid-year, when facilities would reopen. And there are also $3,000 in funding in there for conflict resolution costs. And there is also, it went up quite a bit. I think that in 2020, we budgeted for, but did not spend anything for our youth programs out of the general operating budget. And that funding is restored again in 2021 at 11,000. So I think that grows. I think that's your explanation. Sorry, I could have done that a little more organized, but I think that the numbers will add up to where we have about a half year of programming within the building. We did restore youth funding to the extent that they can restore their programs, and there's $3,000 in conflict resolution costs within that. This is like a test.
Dave Buck has a question. Is the 2021 budgeting assumption the hiring of an interim pastor or permanent one during the year?
Yes. And I'll turn to Donna more to explain that, but the funding is in there. But Donna, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that some of the confusion and how to answer that, Dave, might be in how you're using the term interim. Because we're not sure whether the bishop will be appointing an interim rector or a priest in charge. And so that will depend on what he decides to do. A priest in charge, it's kind of a rent with the option to buy. So we would have them for a couple of years, and then if that works out well, and on both sides, then that person could be permanently called to be our rector. An interim is simply that, an interim for a designated period of time, after which we would then have the search process to get another rector. So yes, a full-time clergy leader is budgeted for, I think, did we start in May or June, Gary? June?
I think it's budgeted beginning in May.
In May. And that most likely would be the earliest that appointed person would start.
So understanding that this is going to be a year in flux with respect to our facilities, when they're open, when they're not open, a year in flux with respect to a priest and when that individual makes his or her way to Emmanuel Church. Vestry, will be monitoring the financials every month, and we'll understand how these financial decisions change and impact the parish.
There's a question here, Marianne, if you don't mind me jumping in, from Margaret and Bill Rowe, and it says, if new pledges come in, will a portion of them be given up to the diocesan pledge? And that is a decision that Vestry had made, that after making sure that our administrative and lay staff got raises or cost of living increases, that anything remaining would go to the diocesan assessment. I do have to say that for the vestry, diocesan assessment and not meeting our requirement was not an easily made decision. And in fact, when Gary came to us with the budgeting process and said, gee, there's a couple $1,000s left over from, you know, the end of the year, how would you like to do it? I have to let you know that the single parent in me who, gee, when you have extra money, you hang on to it for dear life. That was my inclination. And the vestry was pretty adamant that no, we needed to step out in faith and we needed to take any surplus and apply that to the diocesan assessment because we had not met what we had been assessed. So it definitely is a priority for us. I think that, as Gary said, no matter how resilient we are, we need to acknowledge that we're not the same parish that we were a couple of years ago. And we need to make decisions that are very difficult and do it to the best of our ability.
And we're in that really hard time where, because it looks at 2 years ago, the diocesan assessment is going to seem harder for us to hit in our current constrained condition. That it's hard. That said, there's also a question from Matthew Cruz. If a second round of PPP becomes available, will vestry pursue it? And if so, how would it be used if discussed?
It is around. It is not available to Emmanuel. So it requires, Matthew, it requires a 25% drop in revenues between any quarter in 2020 compared to any equivalent quarter in 2019. Emmanuel, in the worst quarter, we saw a 15% reduction in revenues in 2020, I believe third quarter compared to 2019. We're not eligible, unfortunately, in my opinion, unfortunately, to pursue it. Appreciate the question.
I see statements currently in the chat. I do not see further questions. Does anyone have questions?
I'd just like to make a statement that the PPP money, I'm going to push on that, Gary, just to say that we do have cash reserves. We do have a foundation. There are nonprofits that we are competing for that money with that are really hurting. And so I just feel like it needs to be voiced that to take advantage of money that's available needs to be considered within the context of who else may be looking for that money and where it's really needed.
I greatly appreciate the comment. My recollection from phase 2 of round 1 is that there ended up being monies left over. The phase 1 of round 1 was churned through so quickly that then Congress allocated different additional funding after that. I do appreciate it. And by the way, it was, I wasn't there for it, but it was an extremely, it was a big discussion by vestry in terms of whether to take it in round 1. And again, we are not eligible for round 2.
And to be clear, my comment is not an attack at vestry for doing it or anything like that. I just want to say, like, I just want to voice the reasons for not doing it might be something to consider too.
And if we become eligible in anything subsequently, I am absolutely sure that vestry will evaluate those reasons. I want to address to what Clark wrote on Faith and Forsake of All, and that is our largest in terms of dollars. It is our largest beyond the walls of our parish ministry within Emmanuel. And sometimes, yes, Clark, we do think of it as a separate entity just housed here, but it is a part of Emmanuel Church. And Sherry, to your comment, it may be that many parishes will be behind this year on their diocesan assessment.
I don't see any more questions.
Seeing none, I would recommend that we move on. It is afternoon and we still have a bit to go. So if you don't mind, we'll move on to the building and property report. which is found on pages 28 and 29. And before I turn it over to Dave Pluhar, I just want to thank Dave Pluhar, Kristen Brennan, Mark DeYoung, Roger Groh, Martha and Paula Fata, John Martin, Dale Penrose, Tom Smith, and Bob Zager for their work on this important committee. And then included in the report is the information about the steeple repairs, and that will be with Junior Warden Tom Smith, along with Mark DeYoung and Dave Pluhar, who will provide more details at that point. So Dave, if you can get us started.
Thank you, Donna. As Donna mentioned, the full report from Building and Property is on pages 28 and 29 in the annual booklet. And I'm going to take about 2 minutes really to hit the high points for the year, and then I'm going to hand it off to Mark and Tom to talk about the steeple and bell tower issues. So we did notice in the spring, about as the building was closing in March, that the plaster in the bell tower on the ground floor was substantially deteriorating from moisture infiltration. We did have a very wet spring. We believe the moisture is coming in through the stone, and that will have to be addressed as part of the project that we'll be talking about. We had our normal HVAC and plumbing issues like we do every other year this past year. We had some storms in the spring that affected the low voltage communication equipment for the HVAC equipment. We had some issues with the chillers and the boilers. They've all been resolved now. But with a building that's 150 years old and 10 additions and so many systems, this is just normal for us, and we're going to continue to see it. Late spring, when we were hoping that we would be able to reopen at some point during the year, the church did buy materials and equipment to sanitize the building. So those materials are ready when we do go back to regular operation of the building. So we are ready in that regard. We did notice in the fall that there was some pest activity, mostly in the sanctuary. Altar Guild was noticing it and alerted us. We think we've solved the problem with the pests in the sanctuary by using ultrasonic noise generators. I've been told that the activity, the signs of activity have gone away, which is great news. My one point on the budget is that we noticed with the building closed essentially for 3/4 of the year that our gas and utility costs did not drop much at all, which tells us that heating and cooling the building is really what drives our utility costs, and having the lights on and the other equipment that is operated during the week in the building has very little effect on our costs for utilities. And then finally, in September, Vestry asked me to report on the plans for steeple and bell tower repairs. At that point, I was recommending that we could proceed in one of two ways. The first would be what I call the Band-Aid approach, which was to clean, seal, and repaint the steeple because it's a less costly option. And the second option was essentially to restore the steeple with new cladding. Cladding is 150 years old and it is worn out. Steeple, we're going to talk more about the steeple. At that point, Vestry decided that we really needed a subcommittee focused on how to proceed with restoration of the steeple and bell tower. And a subcommittee headed by Tom Smith was created. And Mark DeYoung is going to describe what's been going on and where we're headed. So I'll pass it off to Mark.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Yeah, so Dave covered that the steeple committee was created, and I am a member of that committee. And because of the large cost and because of the historical significance of the steeple, the committee was justified to figure out what's the best way to move forward, and also how will we pay for it once we make a decision. So as a committee member, what I've done, I'll just give you a few bullet points on some of the things we've done. Dave mentioned also over the past 1.5 years, we've had different people go in and inspect the steeple from inside and out. And if you ever look at the steeple on the outside, you can see the rust on the outside and how that looks. But on the inside, most people that have looked at it have said that the substructure, the wood, is strong. It's not significant deteriorated, and we can remove the outer part of the steeple and recover it with a new metal or material of our choice, really, and we won't have to do significant structural changes to it. Along those lines, we've also had some architects come and look at it, one of them including Jim Riddle, who was our architect for the Behold project. And the reason we would get someone like that involved is that they would actually write out the specifications for the types of material that we could recover it with, and also write out the construction specifications for the type of fasteners and the type of methods that would be used to replace the steeple. And we have gotten 2 bids from architects that would write those specifications for us if we choose to go that route. The other route would be to get with metal roofing contractors and have them give us a quote to recover the steeple and have them specify the materials in their quote without paying for any design. And so those are kind of the 2 things we're looking at right now. In general, my hope is that by Easter we will have bids in hand so that we will know the type of material we want to recover it with, as well as what the estimated cost would be. And then, once we have that in hand, we would be able to work on the financing part of that to figure out how it's going to get paid for through, as some people have mentioned, gifts that could be out there. Some people have offered to help with it through private donations. And it looks like, in Gary's report, that some of the PPP money was also set aside for it. So again, I think by Easter, we should have a plan and direction in hand. And with that, Tom, I'll pass it over to you as our committee facilitator and see if there's anything else you want to add before we open it up for questions.
Just want to say, first of all, thanks to Dave and Mark for the presentation. Thanks also to Jim Gretsch, Chris Gregston, Christine Remming, Marianne Vognall, and Kevin McBride, who are all on the Steeple subcommittee. We brought together, we're so blessed at Emmanuel with everyone's talents. We brought together a group. We have members, Dave and Mark, from the facilities, as well as members from the finance committee and members of the vestry, so we can kind of bring everyone's talents together. We're not starting from zero, which is a wonderful place to be. We have some private donations that have already been anonymously made. The vestry decided to use money from a recent bequest and also money from the PPP loans. So we're not starting at zero. So we're in a good place. And we're the next step with the Steeple subcommittee, along with the work that Mark just spoke about, is also taking the talents and the ideas from that group, and also from the finance committee. And just to make everyone aware, some things have been spoken about, or the silent, perhaps some sort of a silent donor campaign, perhaps utilizing another capital campaign, or utilizing the white fund loans with the diocese. There's also been a discussion about looking into historical funds that could be available with the age of the church or within the community, things of that nature. So I'm hopeful and confident that this is something that we will be able to be very successful about and move forward with.
Any questions for either Dave, Mark, or Tom?
Catherine Ziegler had a question that I believe Tom just answered. Catherine, please speak up if that's not correct. She asked, is there money already pledged for the steeple?
I can actually answer that. There is no pledge campaign for the steeple yet. However, there's been 2 members of the parish that has come forward to pledge funds totaling $40,000, in addition to approximately $80,000 that is on hand that could be utilized within capital funds for the steeple. The $80,000 was added to in great deal this year, both by the PPP funds as well as a Laura McCord bequest, which we're very thankful for.
Charlie Walsh had a question.
Yeah, is there a preliminary, and not holding you to it, a ballpark budget for the cost of the steeple repair, or a range?
Dave or Mark, would you like to speak to that? I don't want to.
Yeah, I've heard numbers. I think Rick Kuhn was telling me that a church that he had worked on that used a slate covering was refurbished with copper and slate in the $70,000 range. I've heard $100,000 range, and I've also heard, could be higher than that. One of the things we're going to do when we specify these materials, we're going to get alternate bids possibly of how much copper we would use in it, or would we use aluminum or some sort of tinted steel. Different types of materials I think will change the price greatly, but we're not sure when the last time, if ever, the cladding on the steeple was ever replaced. And so if it has indeed lasted 150 years, it'd be nice to put a material on there that will, could last, throughout the rest of our lifetime at least. But I don't know exactly what the cost ranges will be.
Well, and can I just jump in? We did get a bid a year and a half ago, maybe, to replace the metal cladding, and that alone was $160,000. So again, that's one bid. And to Mark's point, we have choices on what we can resurface it with. But right now, the estimated cost is kind of coming in all over the board.
So Marianne, if I may follow on.
I'm sorry, Charlie. Can I get you after Debbie speaks? She's had her hand up.
Sure.
Go ahead, Debbie.
Yes, please, Debbie.
Oh, I was told, or I understand that we have more than one bell and that they can't be used because of the condition of the tower. So would this include fixing the tower so that all the bells could be used? But maybe I'm wrong.
As I understand it, the bell can be used, but until somebody told us what was going on, we have limited using it. But there's only one bell. It has a clapper inside or the toller outside, but only one bell.
Only one bell. Okay.
Charlie Walsh had a question.
Yeah, and this is really more food for thought as the parish. I mean, Webster's population stayed right around 23,000 since the World War. It was up a little bit during the baby boom years. And I absolutely guarantee, I'd bet my last dollar that we are at the lowest pledge unit amount that we've ever been at during that entire stretch. So two thoughts on the steeple. One, we should get it fixed and we should get it fixed right, I think would be at least a good starting point. Secondly, if it does cost $250,000 or somewhere in that range, which is what it's sounding like to me, that we should not strain the resources of our current generation of parishioners if there was ever a time to use debt for at least 50% of it, I can't think of a better time. We need, as a parish, to change how we go about getting people back in the pews. We are going to have a tremendous opportunity at the end of COVID. And I would hate to see our parish, and if we're going to look at generous donors putting in, we should be looking at evangelical outreach opportunities, as well as just taking care of our historical building. I can't say how passionate I feel about that. Continuing to ignore and never having any type of dollars going to evangelical outreach over and above what we've done historically, when we've seen the number drops that we have, just strikes me as really short-sighted and catastrophically short-sighted. So I would urge the vestry upcoming, and when they look at the steeple, to be creative and financial and consider using debt to get it done and get it done now. So this isn't hanging over our budgetary considerations 5 years from now. That's my comment. Thank you.
Hey, Charlie. Clark Retailing has a question.
I guess to sort of tack onto that, two things. One is, our building is 154 years old. We're the longest entity in Webster that's been continually in the same building of any organization, which is amazing. So I do think there's some ways to get some money outside of our parish to help restore that. I think it's a very important thing. But in addition to that, and I know a few of you know that I've had some ideas bouncing around my head, and I do want to talk to the vestry pretty soon because I've talked to the city. There's 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 churches all in Webster, all close to each other, that are in the same boat. And if we can start sharing some resources among and being a little smarter about how we look at going forward after the pandemic, we're all going to be in a better boat. And so I am really going to gear up on this personally and looking for that, because I know the Episcopal Church is looking at how do you use your building going forward. The Presbyterian Church is looking at how do you use the congregational churches. But even before the pandemic, we all had too much space. So how can we be more creative in sharing the resources of those of our neighbors and be smart about this? So more to come. I'm really excited about it, but we've been saying for the last 10 months that the church is not our building. The church is what's outside of it. I think we need to take care of our building, but how can we make our building more functional for all of us?
Thank you, Clark. Mark, Ann McReynolds has a question in the chat that I think is for you. Has an architect who works with historical structures been consulted? If not, I do hope that will be the case. Our steeple is too important to make a modern adaptation.
Like I said, one of the architects was Jim Riddle, and he worked on the addition of the church, the Behold edition, in which I know they did a lot of effort to try to match the stone and historical outside look of the church. The two that I interviewed, I did not talk to them about how much historical work they've done, but I think Jim Riddle did do a design for the Historical Society, but long story short, I don't know specifically their historical background, but we will be taking that into consideration.
Mark, let me add that when the question has come up in our committee about how the steeple might look after restoration, there has been no consideration of a different looking steeple. The expectation is we are going to restore the existing steeple so that it looks like it does now, just not rusted and paint peeling.
Anything else? Hearing and seeing none. We will move along to the recognition of the vestry, retiring vestry and convention delegates. The mission of the vestry is central to the life and health of the ministries of Emmanuel Church. And I'd like to thank them for the time, guidance, and leadership in an extraordinarily busy year. We have all been served well by their willingness to have hard conversations about difficult issues. I want them to know that I've made a foundation contribution in Thanksgiving for their ministry and leadership. I'd like to ask each of the retiring vestry members to raise your hand, and hopefully you'll all be on a similar screen so we don't have to bounce from screen to screen. But John Mitchell, Jen Dunn, Susan Everson, and Kevin McBride.
Y'all can all say hello or goodbye and then we'll see them.
That's right. Another group
so long, farewell.
Another group of parish leaders that had an extraordinary year with the election of a new bishop are our convention delegates and alternate delegates. They attend quarterly in Metro 3 convocation meetings and represent us at diocesan convention. And the retiring convention delegate is Al Ludwig. Now I'd like to ask the remaining vestry members to wave, do whatever you want to do as I call your name. Peter Bagetto, John Hogue, Jeannie Keys, Lori Parker, Christine Remming, Tom Smith, and Marianne Vognold. Thank you all for your continuing leadership. And the remaining delegates are Nancy Groh, Maura Selsich, Robert Tate, and alternatives Pam Penrose and Margaret Rowe. Thank you for your leadership and participation in Metro 3. This next category, I know I'm going to screw up, so apologies ahead of time. It says introduce the staff and vestry and ministry chairs. There are so many ministry chairs and people who have an active role. So I'm going to concentrate on the introduction of staff, although I suspect none of them need introductions. But none of the things we're doing this morning and none of the things we've accomplished over the past year would be possible without our administrative staff, which are Mimi Ship, who is the heart and brains of Emmanuel, and the Zoom master extraordinaire. Teresa Grumke, our assistant treasurer. Gary's already said what a wonderful addition she is, without whom the bills wouldn't be paid or the lights kept on. And Katie Gregson is the facilitator for all children and youth programs. So all of these folks really deserve our thanks and ongoing appreciation. Ministry chairs from, Charlotte Martin at the Food Center to MJ on missions to the junior and senior high leaders. If you take a look at, and I think it's page 34. I take that back. It's the bottom of page 46. The people that have kept this church going are all listed there and all deserve thanks and recognition. And to do that, truthfully, would add another, half hour to the meeting. So please take a look at that. Please, if you've got the time or the inclination, send one of them a thank you. Let's see what's next. Oh, my report. Okay. In the movie Out of Africa, a character states his belief that the world was created round so that we would not see too far down the road. I can't tell you how much I wish I had remembered that quote before Jenny asked me to be her senior warden about a year ago. I had no idea that what 2020 would hold for our world, our families, and our congregation. You remember what passed for normal in the before times, right? Australian wildfires, which killed 500 million animals, the impeachment trial of a sitting president, the UK withdrawing from the European Union, plunges of the Dow Jones, protests of the killing of George Floyd and affirming that Black Lives Matter, royals stepping away from their expected roles, murder hornets, the death of notorious RBG, massive cyber attacks, a Hollywood producer sentenced to decades in prison for sexual abuse, and that was before the biggest game changer of them all, COVID-19, which led to quarantine, running out of toilet paper and disinfectant wipes, mask mandates, quarantine time distortion, which is a real thing, endless waves of COVID hospitalizations, and the deaths so far of over 400,000 of our fellow citizens. Sorry. As much as we'd like to convince ourselves that all of this has been fake news, we sadly acknowledge that it is not. Emotionally speaking, I'm convinced 2020 lasted approximately 12 months and 487 years. 2020 also challenged everything we've believed about what it is to be church. What we were taught as kids, and feel free to join along if you'd like, it's harder when you've got arthritis, but here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors and see all the people, right? In 2020, it became, here's the church, here's the steeple, the cladding is slipping, where the hell are the people? I don't mean to make light of this past year or its impact on who we are as the people of God. There have been changes. Too many for the part of me that prefers stability and consistency, and not enough for the rebel who also lives inside me that wants to shake up the status quo and see a reordering of the systems that oppress and diminish the too many who have too little. The change in our clergy leadership and the multiple reasons behind it has had a huge impact this year. Our rector of 2.5 years left, and left behind misunderstandings, estrangements, pain inflicted and endured, and a community that has been humbled. Humbled not only because we've been more financially challenged than at any other point in recent history, but humbled because we've experienced firsthand that as much as we see ourselves and strive to be decent, faithful, committed followers of Christ, we have also seen that we can harbor pettiness, resentment, grudges, hardness of heart, and dislike toward those within our own congregation. We are not always the welcoming, inviting, loving examples who reflect the unconditional love of Jesus Christ. In other words, we're all sinners. In other words, we're all human. But here's the good news. God loves us anyway, all of us. At a recent vestry meeting, a member asked if the reason a rector hasn't been found and appointed to us is because we're being sold as a toxic parish. The question was courageously and lovingly asked, and it broke my heart. I know only too well that a failed relationship can lead to a personal sense of being a failure, which can then lead to the distorted belief that one is not worthy of being loved. None of that is true. We are not a toxic parish. We are a parish that had a relationship with clergy that failed. We have the same type of complex history and traditions as any other parish that has existed for over 150 years. Some of those traditions serve us well and some of them do not. I believe God is creating some breathing room for us to sit with our thoughts while we sort out which is which. Sitting patiently does not come easily to most of us. At the start of a new year, however, I already see so much that tells me we've turned a corner. Emmanuel, not only is God still with us, but as the verse in Jeremiah proclaims, "For I know the plans I have for you, saith the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." We have a new bishop. Bishop Dion Johnson is fully involved and not only aware of what Emmanuel is struggling with, he is with us in the struggle. He and Canon Doris Westfall are actively looking for permanent clergy leadership and are making sure we have interim priests to meet our liturgical and pastoral needs while we wait. We have the Lombard Mennonite Peace Center process facilitated by Reverend Edie Bird, a process in which over 80 parishioners are participating. Parishioners that are committed to going below the surface of how things look, being truthful about how things really are, and then expressing their truths in language that is direct but loving. I recently read that Reconciliation Without Truth is a book that falls apart because half of the pages in binding have been removed. Emmanuel is in the process of binding itself back together. Emmanuel is actively seeking truths, sitting patiently with what those truths reveal, and praying about how to respond. There are still some pages missing, pages that may never be recovered. But if I failed to be clear before, please hear me now. No one is beyond the love of God or the welcome of this church. Even though the doors of our building are literally closed, figuratively, they are open to all. Not only open, but we are actively seeking restoration, actively looking to make whole that which has been broken. In some cases, trust will need to be rebuilt. In all cases, relationships will need tending. Community building and restoration are ongoing processes, but I'm heartened by the steps being taken by this community toward reconciliation. We all get to be the prodigal, whether that's the younger brother who left his father's home to do things on his own and immerse himself in the ways of the world, or the older brother who stayed to do his duty, but was consumed with resentment, jealousy, and anger while he did it. Feelings that distanced him from his father every bit as much as his younger brother was separated. In God's eyes, none of us are defined by the worst of our behavior. We all get to come home. We all get to experience the Father's love, which in truth has always been waiting for us. If you've left Emmanuel and these words reach you, come home. You are missed. We long to welcome you back to our community and to hear your truths. Like the Father with both his sons, we will rejoice in your return. We are not the same without your presence. For a long time at Emmanuel's altar, as the bread was broken for Eucharist, we heard the words of St. Augustine, "Be what you see, receive who you are." The gifts of God for the people of God. Emmanuel, you are the gifts of God, created to be gifts for the people of God. We will move beyond 2020. We will move into an exciting and new chapter of who we are called to be. I hope that you'll join us for that journey of discovery. It wouldn't be the same without each and every one of you. Let the church say amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen.
And now we'll have the report of the nominating committee. The nominating committee is tasked with the development of a slate of nominees, and that will be presented by Tom Smith.
Thank you, Donna. Hard to follow that. Want to thank Jen Dunn more than anyone. She really took the lead this year and took a lot off of my plate at a time when it was needed. So thank you, Jen, very much. We're going to miss you on vestry, as well as Susan Everson, Kevin McBride, John Mitchell, and Jeannie Keys. However, we appreciate that and thank that they served on the nominating committee, as well as with Paul LaFata, Tom Buffington, Mary Jane Kuhn, and Brian Weiland. And as you can see on pages 30 to 33 in your annual meeting booklet, we are pleased to announce and present to the parish the following individuals nominated to serve with their time and talents the parish of Emmanuel. For 3-year terms in vestry, Kristen Brennan, Peg Cooper, Elizabeth Call, and Allison Williams. For a 2-year term on vestry, Mary Killian. Our delegate is Debbie Martin, and alternates are Janet Dobbs and Pam Penrose. I'm sure you share my excitement and faith and hope with their leadership and with their hearts being a part of Emmanuel and part of leading us forward. So thank you all.
At this time, you all have your videos on, please, so that members of the vestry and our volunteers can count your votes. And I would ask Charlie Walsh to unmute.
Okay, I would like to propose 2 motions for the floor. The first is to recognize as a parish the caring, loving, dedicated leadership provided by Donna Erickson as our senior leader during this time. And I will open it for a second. Second, anyone?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. Oh, you counting? Oh.
So that Donna doesn't have to report the results of her own. Thank you. We've seen a majority in favor of this motion.
Thank you.
My second motion is, seeing that there are no alternative candidates coming from being addressed by the floor, to nominate that we accept this slate of delegates and vestry members by acclaim. I think I did that right.
All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, I'm going to call it. The slate is hereby elected. Thank you to our newly elected vestry and delegates for agreeing to stand for election. And thank you for our other vestry members and the delegates who will continue to serve Emmanuel faithfully in 2021. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mimi Ship for a report of the parish statistics. In case you, well, I'm going to let Mimi talk.
Okay, hold on, I gotta find it. It went away.
If you haven't read the communication and invitation report, pages 39 through 46.
I apologize, it's a little long.
It is worth every read.
Sorry.
Because it is truly a history of how this parish turned on a dime and kept going in the face of multiple challenges. But I won't take any of Mimi's steam. I'll let her present however she wants to.
Also, Donna, I would say that what's at the very end of the annual report, all of the pictures that were put together, all of that is absolutely wonderful.
Thank you. So the actual parish register is on page, I forget here, it's on page where? It's on page 34, excuse me, 34. What most of you know this, every year all Episcopal parishes fill out what we call a parochial report that's turned into the national church. And the report is comprised of details of service types and number of attendants and all of that sort of thing, who we've lost to deaths and births and baptisms, financial information, and information about our ministries. It's used to forecast overall health of all the parishes and determine trends. Each year we report the average Sunday attendance, which is the total attendance of all Sunday services divided by the number of Sundays. For the past nearly 20 years, this number has been consistently declining for all churches and all denominations. And we've heard several of you talk about it today. For the 2020 parochial report, we have been instructed to count Sunday services only from January 5th through March 1st, 2020. That average Sunday attendant, as reported on page 34, is 185 compared to 196 last year. Additionally, we are not reporting attendance for Easter or Christmas attendance as we have in years past. Emmanuel continued in-person services for 2 more Sundays, March 15th through March 15th, so March 8th and March 15th. And we pivoted then to online services on the 22nd of March. The average attendance for online only services from March 22nd through December 27th is 97. If we add in the in-person, those 2 in-person services, the average is 104. So just wanted you to have that number. In 2019, our Easter attendance at all 4 services was 419. In 2020, it was 0 because we did not do an Easter service because we directed people to visit the Diocese of Missouri service. This year, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day services were pre-recorded. The number of online views for those services was 186 for Christmas Eve, compared to a total of 580 in person in 2019, and 62 online views for Christmas Day, compared to a total of 35 in person in 2019. So given these numbers, you can see why the National Church needed to create a guideline so there was some way to compare. To me, the number that best illustrates the reality of the pandemic is the number of Eucharist. In 2020, we held a total of 37 Holy Eucharist services compared to 159 in 2019. On the other hand, we held a total of 252 weekday services in 2020 and 57 in 2019. That is largely due to the nightly Compline services that began March 17th, 2020. Now, I need to tell you, this is really this is something really new for us. There are 3 new areas of questions on the 2020 parochial report that you all need to know about. First, because of how our worship was impacted, we're being asked to provide numbers for both online and in person, and we're being asked things like, if you offered online worship, was it produced solely by your congregation? Did you offer online services prior to the pandemic? What metrics or analytics are you tracking for online worship? Did you return to in-person worship during 2020? What platforms did you use for worship? What additional expenses did your congregation incur due to the pandemic? Did your congregation apply for the Paycheck Protection Program? What were the primary opportunities, innovations, and challenges in conducting worship during the pandemic? What 3 things have changed most in how the church conducts its ministry? The second area of questions is on racial reconciliation and justice. There are a total of 4 questions in this area. The first one asks if our congregation is actively addressing and working toward racial justice and reconciliation. The questions are answered on a 5-point scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree. Then we're asked if this work is a priority for our congregation. Then 2 questions ask if the Vestry and Bishops Committee, Vestry and/or Bishops Committee, is committed to this work. And finally, the final question asks if the rector/vicar/clergy are committed to the work. We shouldn't see this question as a surprise, because since the General Convention and the Diocese of Missouri. Since 1994, this has been a focus both at National Convention and in the Diocese of Missouri. But it certainly indicates the desires and concerns of the national church and is going to provide a pretty clear collective view. Lastly, the third of all of these different things is that there are 3 narrative questions to be answered collectively by clergy, vestry, and staff, all related to opportunities and challenges of the pandemic, opportunities and challenges for the future, and asking us to list 3 things three things the most in how the church have changed the most in how we think we're going to conduct our ministry. I ask you to read the reports by title on pages 35 through 58 as a way to know and understand how we did respond, where we engaged people, how we were relevant, and then help us think about being at a crossroad. We are really at a crossroad, and we're standing here and hoping that all of you help us with discovery and conversations about how and what the church will look like and be like in the future. Thank you.
All right. Mimi, thank you very much. I think Mimi touched on the reports by title. Hopefully you've done that. Report and reflections of the rector are blank. Don't know what their reports or reflections are this year. Appointment of a senior warden. Sorry, nobody else gets appointed this year. The bishop has asked both Tom as the junior warden and myself as the senior warden to remain as the wardens until a person is appointed and settled. If June or May or June is the first time somebody could get in and then get settled, that might take a couple of months as well. So I suspect that Tom and I will continue as the junior and senior warden going forward. Further business and announcements. I do just want to give you an update. We have no person that's been identified yet as being the person that will be appointed. I will certainly keep you up to date with what I know. There's a person that's in the pipeline for consideration. She wouldn't be able to join us sometime until May or June if there's a discernment that this is a good match for her. Are there any questions though? And I know it doesn't say questions. I know that we're going on over 2 hours here, but if anybody has a question that I can ask about that process, please let me know. If you don't want to take up any more time and do that now, please give me a email. Feel free to call me. I'm always available to talk or answer any questions that you have. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Allison. All right. Not seeing any more hands raised, I would ask if someone would like to make a motion to adjourn the meeting. I see Bob Ziegler has done that. Anybody second? Olabisi seconded. All those in favor of adjourning the meeting? Maybe it would be easier to say, anybody want to keep meeting, raise your hand. I think it's unanimous. Our blessing and dismissal as his last official act with us, I am going to ask the Reverend Paul Metzler to unmute and to bless and dismiss us after we thank him again for extending his time with us and being such a faithful minister to us.
Thank you. Thank you. The reason Emmanuel has such resilience is because it has such amazing, committed and talented lay members. And it's been an honor to serve among you, and I'll still be around. drew my blessing from Philippians 4 with some familiar words. Remember, the Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer, with thanksgiving, present yourselves to God, so that the peace of God, which transcends and transforms all understanding, may guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be upon us and remain with us always. Amen. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.